Lesson 14. Here we go on the next to last instruction. We have a very important subject matter to treat this time, chironomy. Remember, we have seen this word before, chiro, hand, and nomos, law. It has to do with the tracing of curves to direct, and basically the curves express the arsis and thesis of the composite rhythm. So we have already looked at the principles by which we evaluate the context of the melody. That is, whether we assign an arsic or a thetic value to any given ictus, which, remember, commands a composite pulse. We've done that. Now what we have to do is to look back, review the principles involved, and especially though to sharpen our skill at applying it to different musical situations, so that this becomes, again, like second nature, habitual. You can see that this is going to be important not only to direct Gregorian chant. Of course, the one directing will have to trace the curves, but the ones who are following will also have to understand what the curves mean. Does he mean an arsis, or does he mean a thesis? Does he mean more or less intensity? These are the kind of things that we're going to be able to interpret by looking closer at chironomy. So without any more delay, let's go and look at the manual and see what, and review what we've already seen before getting some practice assigning arsis and thesis to the ictus marked out on a piece. So the first thing that the manual tells us is that anything that is climb in the melody and goes up is a thesis. Of course, we're again talking about an ictus, the ictus commanding the composite pulse that follows. Moreover, the more it goes up, the faster it goes up, the higher it goes, the more the thesis. Look at the difference there between the little loop here and more of a loop. Of course, it's not a giant difference, but you wouldn't expect a giant difference in something like Gregorian chant. Everything is in nuances in this kind of music. We remind ourselves that a series of RCs, see on the ictus, make loops. Whereas when the melody goes down, you express that by an undulation. Instead of looping, you undulate, like this. And notice that the curve goes up just on the third count of this composite pulse, and likewise here. 1, 2, 3, it's up on the summit. And the same rule holds. The farther it goes down, the quicker it goes down, the more the undulation follows and gets lower. A series of theses in a row is expressed by an undulation. Now, we have to go back to the board and address a few problems about linking arsis and thesis together. So, we have, logically speaking, we have to be able to link an arsis to a thesis. We have to be able to link a thesis to an arsis. We're going to be using A instead of the Greek. From now on, it's a bit simpler thesis to arsis, we have to be able to link an arsis to an arsis, and then a thesis to a thesis. So how do we do all of those? Well, first of all, how do we do an arsis to a thesis? Well, the arsis to the thesis is the basic curve. Arsis, thesis. Arsis, thesis. And the thesis goes all the way there. That's your basic unit of composite rhythm. How do you do link a thesis to an arsis? Well, the thesis comes like this. The arsis comes up from it. And that gives what we call linking by juxtaposition. That is, when you have two composite rhythms, just two units of composite rhythm, arsis, thesis, arsis, thesis, to link them up, you simply go arsis, thesis, arsis, thesis. There, ictus, arsis, here, thesis, here, arsis, here, and thesis here. That should go like that. There you've linked up an arsis thesis to an arsis thesis. That's by juxtaposition. Okay? Arsis to arsis. That is what we've just dealt with. Arsis, arsis is by loops. And by thesis to thesis is by undulation. Yep. There's one thesis, there's another thesis. Thesis, thesis. Here and here again, ictus and ictus. This is an arsic ictus, this is an arsic ictus, thetic ictus, and thetic ictus. Okay? So that assures our being able to describe any situation, because we know now how to join any arsis to a thesis and any thesis to an arsis, and arsis to an arsis, and thesis and thesis. So we can have very complicated situations like this. Likewise, or anything you can possibly imagine. So we've already been into this because you've already done some work on that in homework exercises 9 and 10. Finally, we have to bring to bear these criteria. So what is going to, in a particular situation, which is going to prevail, the melody or the text? Well, either could prevail. It depends on the circumstances. A little bit like in moral situations, you have to look at the circumstances and see. It's not always clear cut. You can't put down a rule that will hold in every case. Usually it's the melody that prevails, but the text is also very important, and think that the text that we're dealing with there is the Word of God. So what we have to say is that both complete one another. So we have to be able to evaluate the relative importance. And all the art of directing Gregorian chant will lie in discerning what is the most important here. What should we favorize, the text or the melody in this case? And to be honest, there will be some times when it's not too clear that you could go either way, and any not all decisions, but in sometimes decisions could be disputed. It could go one way or the other. You could assign an arsis or a thesis. So let's review once more the rules for assigning arsis and thesis, and for that we go back to the book again. So on the bottom of page 247 we have the the principles of chronomy, and first of all, the principles having to do with the melody. And we restate what we know from lesson 8, that every melodic climb indicates the predominance of an arsis. Doesn't say that it's always an arsis, but it's generally an arsis. Every melodic descent indicates the predominance of a thesis. Every beginning of a melody, every beginning of a phrase, and even a member and an incise is generally arsic. So that's easy to understand. To start something off, to begin a trip, you have to get going, and that's with an arsis. Every end of a piece, a phrase, a member, or an incise is naturally thetic. So likewise, when you end up somewhere, you come to rest, and so which has to do with the thesis. Notice that this formulation adds not only the end of a piece, but the end of a phrase, a member, or an incise. You have to keep that in mind when doing your rhythmic analyses, that this also holds for the smaller divisions. So in the example given, you have an ascending neum and an ascending neum. These would be given an arsis. This would also be an arsis because it's the beginning, assuming that it's beginning of a division. Here you have a generally descending melody, and so each unit, each composite pulse is given a thetic value. Going on, the next principle enunciated, that every ictus placed on the first note of an ascending neum, for example, a potatus, a torculus, remember a torculus is reckoned as an ascending neum because it begins going up. And a salicus, scandicus, is normally arsic. So here you're given various examples of ascending neums. Generally speaking, every ictus placed on a descending neum is normally thetic. Here you have climacus and a clivis, descending neums. Generally speaking, the descending neum has a thetic value. The highest ictus of a musical phrase will generally be arsic, and here you have the highest composite pulse. That will be given an arsic. Generally speaking, it will be given an arsic value. And we could point out that it's not necessarily the strongest arsis. The highest arsis is not necessarily the strongest arsis. It's not good Gregorian style to hit that note hard. So far then, the principles having to do with the melody. There's also some principles we remember having to do with the text. Every tonic or secondary accent is arsic. And every atonic syllable, that's basically every other syllable besides the accents, whether tonic or secondary, every atonic syllable is thetic. So the text runs through an analysis of this phrase here of the introit of Our Lady on Saturday, Salve Sancta Parens. You can read through that. We're going to do another little analysis just to have more experience of different possibilities. So we go over to get our Liber. So we first have to mark off the ictus. First ictus would be there, second one would be there. So this composite pulse, that would have to be arsic because it's the beginning of the piece. It's also on the accent, the attack of the accent of sanctus, a second motive for giving it an arsic value. The next ictus is there, and so we have these three notes to account for in the next composite pulse. The ictus there is thetic, because it's going down. The melody is going down. We no longer have to take account of the accent, although it's still on the accent. It's really the attack of the accent that on which the rule for the text applies. This one no longer applies. It's we're now drawn away from the textual consideration simply by the melody, which is prolonged. It's a little bit like a long passage on an Alleluia. Once the Alleluia is finished, it keeps going on. You no longer are remembering about what you're saying. It's just ah, and it's from there on. It's the melody that is important. The text is kind of left behind, if you like. So, thetic, thesis, because the melody descends. This is the next composite pulse, and that is thetic. Why? Because the melody is going down. It's the end of an incise, and it corresponds to the final of a word, sanctus. The next incise, and we have an ictus here and ictus here. That leaves this composite pulse to account for. What are we going to say? It's arsic. Why? Because it's the beginning of an incise. Because it corresponds to the attack of the accent, and because the melody is going up. What about the ictus here, so we have to account for this composite pulse. What should we say for this? This would be also arsic. Why? Because generally the melody is going up, and it's attaining a summit here. The next ictus here is thetic, because it corresponds to the final of a word and the end of an incise. Next one, the next composite pulse, ictus here, so the composite pulse is here. It's arsic, beginning of an incise, a attack of the syllable, of the accent. Second, this is basically the same as the first incise. Second is thetic, the melody is going down. Third is thetic, because it corresponds to the final of the word. Final always gets a thetic value. The incise, it's the end of the incise, and it's the lowest part of the melody. Okay. The next ictus is here, and the one after is here. So we have these two notes to account for. Okay, now what do? We have a generally rising composite pulse. But we've got, on the other hand, we've got the weak penult and the final. What should we say? What is it? The melody would call for an arsis, whereas these two syllables would call for a thesis. Well, generally speaking, in this case, I would be sure, in order to be sure that the singers do not give a kick into this syllable, I would put this thesis. But it could possibly, one or the other could prevail. You could call this an arsis because of the melody, or a thesis. I would call it a thesis in order not to provoke this syllable being hit, which would compromise the accent. It's dominus, not dominus. It's not two intensive syllables, one after the other. The next ictus is here. That leaves this composite pulse to account for. That's the high point of, no, it's not quite the high point of this incise, is it? Nevertheless, it corresponds, the melody is still going up, and it corresponds to the accent of the word, arsic. Here, the melody is going down slightly, and it corresponds to the final of the word, that thesis. Now here, we have 1, 2, 3, 4. It has to be divided into 2. Ictus here, ictus here. What about this composite pulse? That is generally rising, so arsis. It also corresponds to the tonic accent. This composite pulse here, well, it's the very top of this phrase. It's the very summit of this phrase. That should be arsic. And it's also rising. The next ictus is here, and afterwards this one is marked here at the beginning, or is not marked, but we can mark, or we can see that it must be at the beginning of this noon. So this composite pulse here, well, it's going down, thetic. What about this composite pulse? Well, it's not really going down, it's kind of stationary. But what does it affect? It affects a weak penult, sabaot, which is dactyl. A weak penult, so that should not get an arsis. It should be treated rather thetically. So we put a thesis on that. And then this composite pulse, of course, is going to be thetic because it corresponds to the final and because it's the end of the phrase. You have to stop. You have to end on a rest. Now here, what happens at the bar? That's going to be important because we may encounter full bars in the course of a piece. What do we do there? Well, remember, it all depends on what happens afterwards. Is the next note thetic or non-thetic? Or, is the next note ictic or non-ictic? Well, it's ictic. So that leaves a full 2 beats here, full binary composite pulse of pause. What do we do with that? Well, the only thing we can do there is to put that as a thesis. It makes no sense to have a full silence of 2 beats, which is arsic. So that's thetic. So it comes, you have a thesis on the final syllable, another thesis. Let's draw that in. See? A thesis on this syllable, another thesis, and then, of course, it's going to have to be arsic because it's the beginning of the next phrase. It corresponds to the accent of the word, and well, no, there's no real melodic consideration other than that. So you have a thesis, coming up to an arsis. So it goes like that. So these are the kind of things that you're going to have to be applying for your homework. You're given Curie 9, the same kind of situations. The whole thing is to see where there's a conflict and between the melody and the text, and in that case, which is more important? Which you have to consult your musical taste and the rules. Common sense too. Sometimes it suffices just to see that although the melody is rising a little bit, it's much more important to give the proper shape to the word, etc. The instruction gives a few remarks at the end of the principles it lays down. For the first one is that not every loop and undulation is of the same amplitude. When you want to get people going, you might have to make a great big gesture. Also, when you're directing a whole crowd, you might have to use both hands and use giant gestures. Or if you're just directing a tiny little group, it might suffice to make little gestures with the hand. So not only that, you have a question of the assigning of the arsis and thesis, and that's the third remark. Sometimes you might have to get a choir going, in which case you have to use more arsis, or on the contrary, kind of calm them down. So to direct them, you might have to direct them more with theses and very small gestures in order to just calm things down. This is a question of, applying things with good sense and with musical taste. The director should know what he wants and measure out his gestures accordingly to get from the choir what he wants. And same with the choir choristers, the members of the choir. They have to watch and see and judge according to what he's signifying by his hand gestures, and follow him to have the kind of interpretation that he's trying to bring out. One more remark is that generally speaking, we limit the number of arses in a row to 3 or perhaps 4. The reason for that is that after a while, you can't get any more out of your singers. If you keep on adding arsis and arsis, then after a while, there's nowhere to go for their crescendo. They're already at their peak. So basically, try and, that's a rule of thumb. It may sometimes have to be overlooked, but generally speaking, 3 or maybe 4 RCs is what practically is the limit of RCs in a row. A final little remark, we should be careful about the beauty and the smoothness of the curves we trace. The chironomy that we trace to direct others amounts to a command and a representation of what we want. Finally, it should spring from the root of the Gregorian chant, which is prayer and contemplation. And you can see that there's something inappropriate, that from contemplation there should come something that's jerky or whimsical or even uncertain. There should be something very cut and dried and clear about the gestures. So that's something to keep in mind, first of all, when you're tracing out on paper the curves, and then when you ulteriorly. There's no practice on this in level 1, but ulteriorly, when you're actually doing the curves with your hands, make sure that there's a certain concern for grace, natural grace, the beauty and attractiveness of the movement itself. In the excursus, you have another biography of the second directress of the Scola San Grégoire. Remember, the Scola San Grégoire is the establishment in France which first published the manual in French, which we translated. And this Denise Lebon, a lady who directed the Scola through the hard years of the 70s and the 80s. Now things are coming back a little, whereas they used to get, hundreds for their gatherings, summer gatherings. They went down to, like a handful, and now they're back to, a good 50, 60, 70 for the summer sessions. But she had the courage, at the end, domitable courage to keep going during that difficult time, and saw the Scola through that difficult time, and now things are looking a little better. Read the biography to learn about her. And with the 14th lesson, we look to wrapping everything up, next lesson, with the analysis of a piece. Basically what we're going to do is take all the tools, all the aspects, rhythmic, text, notation, chironomy, all of that, and apply it to a given piece and see what we can say about that given piece and see what each of those aspects has to say about the piece, what light it can shed on the piece. And thereby, we'll have a more profound appreciation of what the piece is expressing, and thus know how the piece should be sung. Of course, what is the end of all this? It's the singing of the piece. We want to sing the piece as it should be sung. And all of these different angles of analysis are aimed at sharpening our understanding of what's going on in the piece, thereby to express the music better. So lesson 15 then will be the wrap-up of the whole course.